So for the past few weeks, we've really been focused on lists and recycler views and kind of showing lists of things, which is good, right? You know, there's a good reason why we spent time on that, and a good amount of time on that is because it's a major part of building apps, right? It's very common that you're going to need a list of something that you need to render some way or another. In fact, oftentimes you'll find that you have recycler views within other activities. Right now we've done the simple case of just, hey, there's one recycler view and that's basically the entire screen, right? So where we're moving today is moving towards having more than one screen, right? Having an app that has a second screen. So in this case, it'll be the detail screen. So you click on a movie, you go to get to the expanded details of that movie. You click on a game, you go get the expanded details of that game, which is a really, really common workflow. In fact, it's known as the master detail flow, or the master detail kind of layout. It's common enough that there is a template for it built into Android Studio. I don't generally use that template, but there is one because it is that common. So, you know, that's kind of where we're working our way to. So that means we're going to be talking about how to add additional activities to the project with their own layouts, with their own activity classes, with their own data. You'll be designing layouts for that detail screen. We'll look at how to handle click events when you click on the cards. So you click on the card, takes you to the other screen. We're going to look at something called intents. We haven't talked about intents yet, but we'll be talking about intents and using something called an explicit intent to open that next screen. Okay. We'll also need to pass some data through that intent. Namely, I need to know which movie do you want to view. So we'll be passing the movie ID as part of that intent object. Okay. So we're also going to see some how we pass data. We'll need to talk about how we implement the view model there, because as it turns out, every screen needs to have its own view model. So we have a view model for the list, and we have a view model for the details. Make sense? So we'll be looking at that as well. We need to look at then how do we use the combination of all that to kind of load the details up. We're going to pull all that data from the database, and then we want to show the one that you specified, right? So you clicked on movie 3, Matrix, whatever, and we want to see the details for said movie. Okay. Also need to talk about then, next thing that comes up is when you're navigating to other screens, you immediately have the need to come back, right? You don't go to another screen, you're not usually going to stay there forever, you're going to eventually come back to where you started. And so the way you come back involves two kinds of navigation. We call up navigation and back navigation. So we'll need to talk a little bit about how that works, what some of the differences are, and how that fits into the project, right? So that's the overall view of kind of the objectives and the topics we want to go through. This is going to open us up to build things that are quite a bit bigger, right? Because as soon as you go, okay, I have a second screen, it's not much harder to step from 2 screens to 10. Right? It's not too hard to go from, okay, now I know how to add another screen, I can apply all those principles to add a lot more things, right? And because we have that second screen, that opens us to adding additional things to the details, such as reviews, add a place to do chats, etc. It opens us up to build a lot more features into the application that we can't do if we're constrained to one screen. Make sense? So this is kind of the point where things are going to open up more, and I'm going to expect you to do more of these things. Like, I'm not going to give you the fully fleshed example because you now have space to do that, right? Previously, we don't have enough screen real estate to do a lot of things, right? So we're limited. Do you have a question? Okay, so I will say that the stuff I'm going to talk about, you can kind of see the reading material. There's a bunch of different articles. The information, unfortunately, is pretty spread out. So I'm pulling in little bits of information from here, a little bit of information from here, a little bit of information from here. I wish there was one unified place to pull all this, but you can look at my notes, and that's kind of pulled all together. Okay, so let's start from the top. Where does this process start? So when I want to add another screen, well, the first thing I need to do is add that activity, okay? And so the way that I do that is basically I'm going to right-click in the project until it's add a new activity. So I'm going to show you where this is. If you don't have Android Studio already pulled up, definitely do. You need to make sure, as we usually have it when your project loads up, you want to make sure you're in the Android view. If you're in the project view, this option's not going to be there, right? And that's, remember, normally there when the project's booting up. But once it's booting up, you should be in the Android view of the project pane. I'll go ahead and close all those tabs. So under there, you can actually do this in a bunch of places. In my experience, it looks like you can do it anywhere that's under app. As long as you're under this app folder, anywhere in here will have the same effect. So if I say new, okay. Now, remember we have used this new menu before. We've used it to add additional files in various types. So things that we've done already, we've gone to, you know, your classes, your Java, and we've said new Java class, right? So we've done that a good number of times, right? That will create a new class. You can also go into layouts and say new and new layout resource file, okay? It turns out in order to add a new activity requires 3 steps, not just those 2. There's a third step. So basically, in order to add a new activity, you need 3 things. You need to add a new Java class for the activity. You need a new layout for the activity, and you have to register in the manifest. That third one is the one that usually people forget, is forgetting to go up to the manifest. So for instance, if we look at what's in the manifest already right now, you'll see that there's an activity there. So everybody see that activity? So there's already a main activity that's registered. And so that's inside of the application tag. This activity tag, you can see it's got some sort of an intent filter in there, which kind of tells it how to open up. Namely, that intent filter is actually telling it that it's the main screen or the main activity. It's where the user starts when they click on it from the launcher. Okay? So that's the other part that we need to do. Now, you can do those 3 steps manually. More than likely, if you do all 3 of those things manually, you're going to get something wrong. And you're probably going to forget to register it. So I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. Okay? The good news is there's a way, there's an option you can click which will just do all 3 of those things for you. Just click it and it'll do all the things at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in here, say new. Rather than going to Java class or whatever, I'm going to go down here to the bottom. You see new activity, right? So I'm not making a new Java class, I'm not making a new layout, I'm making a new activity, okay? You'll see there's a bunch of options, right? A bunch of different layouts, a bunch of different starting points. Remember when we start a project, which of these do we usually start with? Empty activity, right? So I'm going to follow that same process, and I'm going to create another empty activity this way. So down here, empty activity, you get this popping up, which is going to ask you to name the activity and to name the layout that goes with it, right? Because it's actually going to, again, do all 3 of those steps. Create the class, create the layout, and register it in the manifest. So convention is that when you create a new activity, the name of the activity always needs to end in the word activity. Name of the activity always needs to end in the word activity. Okay? That's by convention. So if we're making a detail screen for movies, I might call this my movie details activity. Okay. But notice I'm not calling it movie details, it's movie details activity. Part of the reason for that is typically if you've got a class saying movie details, then I would expect that to be a data class. I would expect that to contain the data for the movie details. Versus if I see movie details activity, I know that's the activity that displays the movie details. Does that make sense? So it just helps in terms of naming conventions, and that way you don't get overlaps where 2 things are named the same thing. So I'm going to call it movie details activity. You'll notice the convention as well. Any new class is uppercase, is Pascal cased, and we're separating that. Also notice as I change the name activity, you see that it changed the name of the layout? You see that in the second field? So you do want to make sure that that second field, the layout name, is correct, but usually just by entering the first field, it will update the name to fit it. Because it does look at, okay, camel casing is separating words. So when we're doing the XML, we separate those words by underscore, but you'll also notice there's a slightly different convention in when we're dealing with the class, the convention is to end it in activity, but when we're dealing with the layout, the convention is to start it with activity in lowercase. Both of those things are conventions I expect you to follow, is to end the name of the activity with the word activity and to start the layout with the word activity. Cool? Okay. So those are really the only two fields that you have to pay attention to here. The rest you can usually leave alone. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit finish. It says changes have been made. Yep. Let's see what happens here. That may be because I was practicing with this before. Okay, so you'll see there, now that I've finished that, I've created that, you'll see that there's a new class in here. So there's movie details activity as a new class. There's the layout over here, activity movie details. And if I look at the manifest, right, you can see that there's an additional activity in there, right? You see that additional activity tag? I don't know why it's putting it before. I think it did used to put the activity before the main, but typically I do kind of arrange these chronological or hierarchical in terms of how the user is going to access them. So typically I would like to move these around a little bit and say, okay, main activity, and then you're going to get to movie details activity. So again, I usually move these around a little bit after the code's been generated, but the important part is that it generated it. Cool? Makes sense so far? Now, so that's added an additional activity to our file, to our project. What it has not done is provided the user any way to get to said activity, right? We have another screen, but the user has no way to get there. Cool? So, you start with that, and that is another thing we still have to fix. Now, go back to my notes. So that's how we do that setup. And again, I would recommend doing it that way. Generally, the next thing I do, immediately next thing I do is go to start fleshing out the layout. So go to start putting some of the views and the text views that we need on that screen, right? I would really recommend, if you're doing this for yourself, right, and maybe future projects, if you don't have a mock-up, go make a mock-up before you do this, because there's a lot of unknowns when you're starting a new screen, right? In terms of what do you need, where should you put it, what are all the things that should fit it. So I've given you a mock-up already. It's in your assignment. Kind of looks like this, right? So what I'm asking you for is there's an image up top, right? This is the main banner image for the game. You've got the name of the game. You've got a description of the game. You've got whether, does it support controllers, or, maybe it only supports it in menus, etc. Controller support, multiplayer support, what kind of genres does it fit into, what tags, what keywords can you look it up by. So here's a bunch of those. You got your consoles, and then you got some screenshots. So that's the kind of layout that I'm asking you to build for the lab. Cool? For the sake of time and in the interest of moving through this quicker, I'm going to do a simplified layout for this project today. So I'm just going to put in some of that data, right? So namely I think I'm just going to put in two text views, the title, the name of the movie, and the description for the movie. And just to keep it simple, because I think the rest of that you can kind of figure out for yourself. Okay? Mainly I'm focused on the navigation part of it today. All right. Going back into the project, that means here, for sure, I need a text view for the name or the title, a text view for the description, and I'm going to add one more, which actually is going to be to contain any error messages, right? Which is going to happen, right? It's going to happen sometimes that you need to display an error because, hey, you need to say, hey, this movie doesn't exist, it's been deleted, or maybe we failed to find it, so there's a networking problem of some sort, etc. So we want to have a place to display error messages. All right, so that first text view, I'm going to call error text, or movie error text. Yep. And this one I'm going to call the movie title text and the movie description text. So I just got three quick text views in there. All of those I need to remember to set up their text. I don't want to have any text in there to start with, so I'm going to remove that. But I'm going to put in the designer text, and I might say error text. And maybe this is going to be movie title and movie description. Okay, I'm going to anchor that all to the top left. And stretch it out to the right. Boop, boop. There. And maybe I'll take all of those and stretch them out. So 0 dp. Oh, that didn't get the other ones. 0 and 0. Little details in terms of styling. I might want to change the color of my error to red, so I'm going to go pick that. I think I already have. Yep, I already have an error code. So I'm already going to use that code there. I'm going to make that text bold and a little bit bigger. So maybe 24 SP. Same thing with the movie title. 24 SP and bold. Just establishing a little bit of styling and maybe 16 SP for the description. That's going to make this a little bit bigger than its base default size. Cool so far? I might want to quickly add some margin around the edges. The easiest way to do that is jump back over to the code and just at the top say Android layout margin 8 dp, and that'll push everything in just a little bit. Cool. So relatively simple layout, but it's enough to get us started, enough to see that the data is working. So far we've done two things. We added the new activity, and we've kind of laid out the layout for it. All right. Next up, if we're looking at here, next thing I may want to do is start to work towards creating a way for the user to get to this screen. Okay? And so in order to get to the screen, I want the user to click on a card and then navigate over. Okay. So I need to hook something up into the adapter. Remember the adapter we've set up on click listeners before. We've hooked this up for the upvote and downvote. In this case, I don't want the user to actually click on a button. I want the user to click on the card itself. And so the way to get to that is I'm going to say vh.itemView, uholder.itemView. ItemView is the root component of that layout, which if we look at our layout, remember the thing that's at the root is the card view. Does that make sense? This is one of the reasons why it's important for that root to be the card view. If your root is another layout, say if in my item layout I've got a constraint layout or a linear layout at the top, then this is not going to exactly have the desired behavior. It's going to behave a little bit different. You won't get any of the animations. Cool? So it is important for this sake that the card view is at the root. And I can go back and look at the layout really quickly to just take a look at that. Right, so you'll notice in the code, card view's out here, constraint layout's inside of that, and so there's no additional thing outside of the card view. Okay. So, just like any other view, we can add an on-click listener to that, right? So we can say on-click listener, take the view, like I've done with the previous, I can use that get it after position to find out, okay, well, I know what index in the list it is. Let's go find that movie summary, and then we're going to use that data to open the right screen. Cool, because basically I need the ID. So I'm going to add this code in as just a starter point to just verify that that as much is working. I'm going to take this here, and I need to go back to my project. I need to go into the adapter. And so you can see I've already got on-click listeners for the downvote, on-click listeners for the upvote. I'm going to add that to the end here. So on the item view, we're going to say set on-click listener. We're going to go grab the movie summary, and then for now I'm just going to log that you clicked on movie, spitting it out .id. That's enough to verify that just the basics are working, that I am getting the ID. Okay? And that event is firing. So I'm going to fire that up. Take a look here. So let's see, logcat, I need to go to info, and I'm going to click on the card, right? So that would be outside of the buttons. So if I click here, you can see clicked on movie matrix, clicked on movie matrix 2, matrix 3, right? So you can see that much, that first part of it is working. Cool? Make sense? So kind of responding to clicks on the card is just as easy as responding to clicks on the button. It's the first thing you realize. It's just what the user is clicking on. Okay? But usually we want that on the card itself. Okay? Next question is, now that I've got that click listener, I've got it responding to the user clicking on the card, I need to then send the user over to the other activity. Does that make sense? Right? I need to send them over to the other activity. I need to tell that other activity to look at this particular movie ID. Okay? So going back here, there are a few things that I need to explain, and kind of some definitions that I need to give before we get to that code. So there's a few things that we've kind of danced around, we've kind of played around with, but we haven't really dived deeply into. And so I do need to give you some definitions before I kind of explain how we're going to do this. Okay? So there's a little bit of theory dump here. So first thing to know is in Android there's this term called app component. So an app component is an essential building block of an Android app. That's what you need to know. Android component is any essential building block of an Android app. So each component is an entry point through which the system or user can enter your application. Okay, there's 4 different kinds of app components, actually. So there's activities, there are services, there are broadcast receivers, and there's content providers. Okay. Here in this course, I'm going to focus primarily on activities. I'm going to not focus very much on the other 3. Just a little history lesson. So activities are basically screens. Services are ways to run code in the background. And historically, services were used to run code when your application isn't running. That was their main usage. They could be used while the application was running, but the main usage historically was to use them for background services. Things have changed in the Android world in recent years to the point where those aren't really useful anymore. They've been replaced completely with something called the Work Manager. And so you have to use Work Manager to do background work. Okay. So if we get to a point where we want to do background work like that, then we'll talk about Work Manager and we'll be using that in place. Similarly, broadcast receivers in that same batch of changes kind of got killed. The idea of a broadcast receiver is to receive a system-wide event of things have changed, usually with the hardware, but sometimes things have changed in another app. So they're serving 2 purposes, both to get hardware changes and to get notifications from other applications. Okay. Android changed how that works so that they are not as useful anymore and they're really going away from them. So things like the way we set up the network connectivity used to be that I would use broadcast receivers to monitor the network connectivity. That doesn't work anymore. So we've got the new connectivity manager and the network callback. So that is the main place where we used to talk about that. We don't need to do that anymore. Also, Work Manager is related to that because it also monitors connectivity for you. Content providers is a way for one app to provide data to another app. Okay, so for instance, one of the common content providers in Android is the address list. So the address list is provided as a global sort of content provider that you can use. So you can expose contacts to other applications, or you can provide it to you. It's also used for media. So say you need to grab an image from your photos, from your gallery, that goes through, depending on how you set up, may go through a content provider. Okay, so mainly content providers are about providing data between apps. Because of that, we're a little bit limited in what we can do because we're focused on building our app, and that's usually where most apps are. They're not necessarily, it's relatively uncommon for an app to provide data for another app, right? It does happen, like in Facebook's case, it does. You can provide your friends list as a content provider, but that's a little bit less common. Does that make sense? So I have talked about some of these things in the past. I have talked about services and broadcast receivers. I haven't really bothered to talk about content providers because it's usually not helpful. But those are other application components here. The reason we want to mention that is because that term will come up again here. And a lot of this stuff relates to both other kinds of components to a similar extent that it relates to activities. So in terms of like working with intents actually are related to all 4 of those. Okay? So let's talk about more in detail what an activity is. An activity so far we've only had one. You saw a minute ago that I just added a second one, right? And we can actually add an unlimited number of activities. There's not really a hard limit on Android about to how many activities you can have. As long as you have enough disk space, as long as you're not worried about your app being too large, you can keep adding more activities, okay? So an activity is an entry point for interacting with the user. And it represents, in the Android space, it represents a single screen in the app, right? So if I have 5 different screens in the app, I'm going to have 5 different activities. It's possible for me to reuse those activities. So for instance, if I have 2 screens that are very similar, like maybe adding a review or editing a review, those might be almost identical in terms of interface. I might blend those together into the same activity. But generally speaking, it's something that's, okay, here's a screen. Okay. So for instance, if you have an email app, there might be a few different activities there. There might be an activity that shows you your inbox, your list of emails. There might be another activity for composing or writing an email. And you might have a third activity for, say, reading an email, right? And you can kind of think about that as like, hey, our list of things, our detail screen, and maybe some sort of write a review, etc. Right? So in some sense, we're even similar to that email sort of functionality, because you see this very common. Okay. So together, so one thing to know is obviously these activities are going to work together to kind of give that user that experience. They're also really meant to be independent, right? One activity should know very little, if anything, about any of the other activities in the application. That means things, so for instance, if we have state data, we have instance variables in an activity, that state data should never be read from any other class, from any other activity. You shouldn't be having getters on the activity where you say, hey, here, activity that you came from, let me get data from there. Because one of the interesting things about way the activity works is you're not forced to go through them in maybe the way you would expect the user to do. In fact, it's very common for the user to maybe skip into a particular screen or a particular activity from some other activity or from a notification where they might not follow the way you expect them to be. So that means things like, okay, we're adding this detail screen. It's actually possible that the user might go directly to that detail screen and skip the list. Does that make sense? It's possible that that could happen. Ways that that could happen, say maybe they're following a link from the internet, and maybe that link from the internet pulls them into the app. Maybe they're following a link from an email, a promotional email that you sent out. Hey, here's this new movie, and you want to link into, and they click that link and immediately goes into the movie details without going through the movie list. You also might see things with notifications. Like notifications might say, hey, there's a new movie out. This movie just came out today. It's in theaters. And they can click the notification, takes them directly to this screen, right? So there are a lot of ways that this could bypass your expected navigation. And because of that, we can't have tight links between the activities. Everybody tracking with me there? So it kind of has to, you have to pretend, well, maybe they're in this activity, maybe they didn't get here the way I'd expected them to. Cool? So those are some things you have to be aware of. So an example they give here, you know, where this might occur, you might start with, say, your camera app, and then in your camera app you might decide that, hey, I want to share this photo with somebody. So you click share, it opens up your options, and you say, hey, I want to use Gmail or my email app. And I click on Gmail, and it then takes that photo over to Gmail. Now I'm transferring data from one application, from my camera or my photos app, to my email app. Data has to travel between two different applications. Well, you know, those don't have a connection, and also notice that I'm skipping past the new email list. I'm skipping past my inbox. I'm going directly to maybe the compose page, right? So again, different places where this could happen. Okay. So in general, an activity is in charge of a few things. It's in charge of keeping track and working with the interactivity of the things that are currently on the screen, right? Accessing your views and working with those. Remember, activity is the only thing that should be touching your views. No other classes should be touching your views. They're in charge of storing data when the user leaves the screen, oftentimes. So you're seeing to say, hey, temporarily, maybe I'm going to use another app, or I'm going forward into another screen. That activity needs to save that data, maybe put some stuff on hold, put some stuff on pause. And then when you come back, it's also in charge of restoring the data, right? So maybe you need data that you need to bring back into use. Also in charge of things like providing navigation. You need to provide a way to get from screen to screen to screen. That's also the activity's job. Okay? So there's a few things that kind of fall into the purvey or the purview of what activities are responsible for. Every activity that we implement will be a subclass of activity. It turns out actually most of our activities are subclass of app compat activity for backwards compatibility reasons, as well as to support some newer features that Android's added. But there's also a guide that you can look further. It's called the Activities Developers Guide. If I follow into here, boop, click on that. If you want to know more about activities, there's a whole page on this, right? So introduction to activities. I've linked that up on the first page because it's a good read. Okay, so you kind of understand app components, what I mean by that, right? And you can understand maybe what I mean by an activity now. Cool? Okay. So let me give you the definition of an intent, which is the main thing that we want to use and the main thing that's new today. Is an intent is a messaging object that you can use to request an action from another app component. Okay? So you can request an action from another app component, right? Remember what app components are. App components are activities, their services, their broadcast receivers, or their content providers. So in this case, we're using the intent to communicate between two activities. Okay? It's the message that we package things up into an intent. It's a tiny little package. Send that over, and then on the other side, we read it. Make sense? So we're kind of limited on how we could do the communication, but it has to be in this intent package. There's a few different ways that we can use this. So we can use that intent to start another activity. We can use that intent to start a service, like a background service, or we can use it to deliver a broadcast, which would be a message to other parts of the system, right? Other applications or other components of our application. So there are two kinds of intents. There's what we call an explicit intent, and there's an implicit intent. And the distinction is kind of important. So in an explicit intent, you're telling it, specifically, I want to send this message to this object, this kind of thing, this class. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, let's go from main activity to movie details activity. I know what activity I want to go to. So that would be an explicit intent. Make sense? If, on the other hand, I don't know what my destination is, and maybe I want the Android system to figure out what's the default tool, the default app for that operation, for that action, then I'm going to build up what's called an implicit intent. Okay, so an example of an implicit intent would be like sharing. If I want to say, hey, let's share this picture or share this message to my social medias, that would involve implicit intents. If I want to say, hey, I want to use the camera to take a picture and then get that picture back, that's an implicit intent. If I want to open something in their default browser, implicit intent, make a phone call, write out an email, all those kind of things where I don't know what application it's going to, that's an implicit intent. Does that make sense? So, large in part, if you're going to another application, it's going to be implicit, or the Android operating system, it's going to be implicit, but if we're working within our own app, it's going to be explicit. Cool? Make sense? Okay. So today I'm focused really just on explicit intents, because that's what we need for this setup, but both of those are there. Okay. So let's talk about how we build an intent and what goes into it. So an intent, as I said, is a messaging object. It's a little package that we can use to facilitate this communication. That intent has a few different properties, a few different pieces of data that can hold. Okay. First part in there is the component name, the name of the component, the application component that you're trying to send this to. That would be, for instance, the name of the activity class, that would be the activity class, or the service class, or the broadcast receiver, or whatever it may be, right? And we're saying here's the destination. We use that if we're building explicit intents. That's what makes it really explicit, is you put the component name in there. If you don't put that in there, then it's implicit, right? That's really the first part that determines is it explicit or implicit is whether or not it has the name of the component. It's worth mentioning that that name of the component has two parts to it. It has, first of all, it has the class. It has the fully qualified name to the class. That includes the package name. So like edu.ranken.prsmith, movie list, movie details. It's that whole path. Also in there, it has the package name for your app. Remember when we created this app, we created a name for the package. That's also required. Right? So both of those things are used to specify the name of the component. The next piece that you can have in there is something called an action. And an action is a string that kind of generically specifies what we want to do. So for instance, you want to capture a picture, I want to view this thing in my browser, etc., etc., etc. Also, I have a category, which says what kind of thing am I looking for. And both of those two pieces together, action and category, are used for building implicit intents. So if we don't know what application we're going to, rather than specifying the class name, rather than saying, hey, I want to go to this class, this component, I say, here's an action and a category, and it'll figure out what component, what activity to open up. Cool? Okay. We're not going to need these two today, but there are relevant, and if we come back to implicit intents, we will care about those things. What I'm more cared about is how do we pass additional data? So there's a data parameter, an extras, and there are flags. All three of those provide a way to provide some extra bits of data. How they're used varies a bit. So data specifically has to be a URI. Okay, has to be the URI of the resource that you're trying to operate on or take an action of. So for instance, if you're trying to open up a web page, then that URI is going to be the URL of the web page. If I'm trying to open a file, then it would be the URI for that file. Remember that the web URLs typically start with HTTP : or HTTPS : if we look at a path that looks like this, right? Starts with file : / that's actually not considered a URL, it's a URI. Looks very similar, URIs and URLs are very similar, but they're not exactly the same, okay? So URL, if it's HTTP or HTTPS, it's definitely a URL. If it's not one of those two protocols, it's more than likely a URI. Turns out all URLs are URIs, but not all URIs are URLs, right? So it's a broader classification. Maybe one way to do it with a Venn diagram, hey, here's URIs, and URLs are a smaller category with that, right? And in large in part, you can just look at the protocol. Okay. Cool. So they kind of look the same way. There's just that distinction that the protocols can be a lot more different things, and what happens after has a lot more variety to it as well. Okay? So if I have that, then I can pass things through here. So again, common things that would be most common is URLs and URIs for, hey, here's a file that's on the user's device that I want to open up. But it can be other things as well. Okay? Things you might use this for, some applications have application-specific URIs. So I might, for instance, say, hey, maybe this is Facebook, and it might be something like Facebook user, right? That would be like a URL for somebody's profile, right? If I wanted to look at maybe some like a post, right? It would be the same, similar kind of thing, right? That might be a URI for a post. Make sense? So you can kind of add in your own If you can reserve a protocol name at the beginning, a lot of apps do that. They might reserve that and use that for themselves. Okay. So that's the kind of explanation with that. So if we do have a URI, we can pass that. There are some apps, some implicit intents that require the data to be passed that way. But in general, it is really limiting. Because you can only have one URI, and it has to be URI, like the one data parameter. So it's limiting how much data we can use there. So most of the time, I'll actually pass the data using extras. Extras allows us to use a big key value, bunch of key value pairs. We can send that through. Kind of think about it like a map, right? Extras is kind of like a map. So I can put in integers, I can put in floats, I can put in strings, but they're all these key value, name value pairs. So I give it a name, which is a string, and then another value, which is some different type. Okay? And last thing we can do is we can add in flags. Flags are kind of like true, false, off and on. And they change how the thing's going to behave. So how is the activity going to be launched? It changes both how they get launched as well as what happens afterward. This is largely used with notifications, those flags, and in cases where you may want to split your app into different, what we say, tasks. Okay, flags are beyond the scope of what we need to talk today, and most of the time, it's worth mentioning, most of the time we don't need to set flags, usually just with notifications. Okay, so the two to focus on there is we can use data and extras to send additional pieces through. Different information with the intent. Okay. So simple case, let's say I just want to start a new activity. Okay. Starting a new activity looks like this. We need to create a new intent, and we just have to call start activity. So I say, hey, I'm going to say new intent. It takes 2 arguments, right? So the first one is a context, which is generally going to be our activity. The activity where you're at right now is generally that context. You're then going to give it the class for the other activity, so like second activity dot class or movie details activity dot class. We create that intent, and then on the context, again, usually the activity, we say dot start activity, passing the intent. Okay, good. From there, the Android operating system will kick in, will take over, we'll read that intent, go open up your new screen. Right? So that's large in part all you have to do to open up a secondary screen. Does that make sense? So as long as you don't need to add additional pieces, additional information that you need to send through, that's all it requires. So I can try that with our application. Right? So I can try that here. I can say, okay, let's create a new intent. Do Alt-Enter, new intent, and I'm going to use the context. So one of the reasons why I added the context to my adapter earlier is because I knew I would need it for this. And then I would need to go to movie details activity dot class, right? So I specify the context and the class. And I'm going to say context dot start activity, passing in that intent. So with just those 2 lines added to the on-click listener, we can take a look and see what this is doing. So I can now click on any of these movies, and it'll take me over to this screen. Okay. Now there's not very much interesting happening there right now because remember I haven't put any code into that activity. Make sense? But we can see that something's happening, right? Just not much of anything, right? So I might just to verify, just to see those things are happening, I might want to take a look at the code for movie details activity, and I might want to maybe fill in some of the data. So maybe I add some text views. So maybe I go in private text view. We've got our error, our movie error text, movie error text. I'll hit enter. I need another one for the title. So movie title text, private text view, movie description text. Okay, so I'm going to add those variables. While I'm here, I might want to go ahead and add a constant, private static final for my log tag. Now, one thing I might want to mention, let me go ahead and set this up first. I've been kind of doing it this way. I've been using a string. The danger of doing this is that it's very easy for that string to get out of sync with the class name. So if you want it to be the name of the class, a common way to do this instead is to write it like such. I can say movie details activity dot class. Dot class will give me the class object. From there, I can call get simple name, and that'll actually give me the string that I had before. So this is effectively to just saying, effective to, as the same as saying the movie details activity, it's just that it survives refactors better. Does that make sense? So if I change the name of this class, then the tag will be updated as well. Whereas if I'd hard-coded it previously, they could get out of sync. So I would say that at this point, it's a better habit to start switching over this, because you're going to start to have more classes and more activities to work with, and you don't want to accidentally, copy some code over or whatever and find out, hey, I can't see my log messages because the tags are wrong. Make sense? So this is a good habit to start doing at this point if you haven't switched over yet. All right, so I've got those. Let me just put a note on there that this is a constant. So constants, because I'm going to be adding another one in a minute. We need to then find those views. And so movie error text is equal to find view by ID, r.id dot movie error text, movie title text, find view by ID, r.id dot movie title text, movie description text, find view by ID, r.id, movie description text. Okay, so just for illustration purposes, I'm going to very quickly here populate them with some text. So I might say movie error text, set text under construction. Obviously, I'll pull this stuff out here later. Movie title text, set text, title. So I can just verify that that code is actually running when I click on the button. That way I'm not looking at a white screen. One thing you might notice is that the header of this says movie list. Does everybody see that? typically I want the headers to change. We kind of call that bar at the top the app bar. And typically that should change if I go here. You will notice that I can hit back. I can hit the back arrow on the device. That will pull me back to the previous screen. But I'm missing one common thing, and we'll talk about how to do this later, is I'm missing an arrow in the top to click that and go back, right? Cool. Only way for the user to get back is pressing back on this.
So is that like an accessibility thing? The arrow at the top?
To add the arrow here?
Yeah, because I mean, like technically with Android phones, you wouldn't really need it, right? Because you have the back button. So is it accessibility or?
It's a few things. It's a few things. It's first of all, it's a requirement from Android for the Android specs, for the design guidelines. The design guidelines really ask for it to be there, and a lot of users do expect it to be there. Okay. For most users really do expect that button to be there. I don't know that that's necessarily an accessibility thing, because I think from an accessibility standpoint they can still press back, but it's largely a kind of design guidelines. The expectation is that it's there. Cool. It's also just a matter of, this might seem weird, but some users are not very comfortable using those buttons. Namely, usually older users. More elderly users are more accustomed to using the nav bar than that. Okay. So one thing I might want to do real quick before I get too far into this is I might want to change that bar. And the way that we do that is we go up to the manifest. In the manifest, you can see that there's two things that are set on this. There's the name and exported, right? Notice that neither of those have a label set. What we typically do is go in here, I'd say Android label, and say I want the header to be movie details. That's how you specify it. It's the label. And I might want to do that for both of these, where I say Android label is movie list. So this one's the movie list and that one is the movie details. Cool. So now it says movie details, and this one says movie list. Thing to remember, we typically want to extract any strings that are user visible. So this is a case where we need to do that as well. The good thing about the movie list is I kind of already have it. If I look at strings XML, you'll see that there's already a key called app name, which already says movie list. So I can reuse that one. I don't need to extract that one again. So here, I'm going to do @string / app name, and here I'm going to do nope, I need to extract it. So Alt Enter, extract string resource, and this is going to be movie details, or I might call it movie details activity, whichever. But now that that's been extracted. So what you should see here is both of those should be @string instead of explicitly having a value.
Can you show that again?
Yeah. So this one I just changed because app name was already there. Mm-hmm. This one I did, it was movie details. I hit Alt Enter and went here to say movie details.
Thank you.
So Alt Enter is generally the shortcut to do the extraction regardless of where you're at. Cool. So that's just a quick fix there in terms of making the app bar have the right text. Cool. That's really helpful. Even early on, I would recommend doing this right away because it makes it much easier to follow where you're at in the application. Otherwise, if the app bar doesn't change, it can be a lot harder to tell which screen you're on. Okay? All right. So, next up, let's talk about how we send data over. Because right now I have the problem that I am opening this other screen, but I have no way to know which movie I should show, right? Because I haven't passed that data through. So the way that we pass data through, you can use that data parameter. I generally don't for most things, because most things end up not being a U or I. So I might do something like this. Let's say I want to create that second activity. I want to put in a string and a number. Okay? I can give those names. So like here I'm saying name and the value is test. And here I'm saying number and the value 1. So we do that by calling this put extra method. Now that put extra method is overloaded. So actually there's a bunch of different versions of it that take different data types. It is important to pay attention to what overloaded is, because if I put in an integer, then I have to read it over as an integer. If I put it in as a float, I have to read it on the other side as a float. Put it in a double, you have to read it on the other side of double. If I put it in as an integer and try to read as a float, you're actually going to get an error, vice versa. If I put in a float and try to read an integer, you're going to get an error if the data types are different. Okay? That could be really easy to miss, especially if you're hard coding things in this, and I expect this to be a float, but because that's an integer, that's a literal integer. Okay? All right. So what's the data we need to send over? Well, the data we need to send over is the ID of the movie, right? So I might hard code this. One way I could write this is I might go back to the adapter, and I might say, okay, we need to send the ID of the movie. So I'll say intent dot put extra, and I'll put this name as movie ID, and this would be movie dot ID. Okay, so I could write this way, and I could just hard code in the key. This does create a bit of a problem because I'm going to need to reference this key, that movie ID string that I've got. I'm going to need to reference that both in the adapter and in the detail screen. And if it's just a string, if you go to try and refactor that or go to try to change it, more than likely your thing's going to break because there's no obvious connection between those two things, right? It's just a string as far as it's concerned. So we typically want to avoid writing it directly this way. Right, with me there? Because it's going to be referenced and used in two different places, and to somebody new to this or hasn't been actively working with this, it may not be obvious that those two places need to stay in sync. I want to use a constant so that both places have the same value. Cool? So the place you want to define these constants is in the child activity. Okay? Wherever you're sending the data to, that's where you should define the extras that it needs to receive. Okay? It's legal and it's valid to declare that either in the adapter or in the movie details activity, but really, like, movie details activity shouldn't know anything about the adapter. So if you declare it there, you're kind of creating a connection where it's connected to your adapter now where it shouldn't be. So we always put it into the destination. So up in movie details activity, I'm going to declare this constant. I'm going to mark it public static final string, and this is going to be extra movie ID. And so this is just movie ID. Okay. A few things you'll notice from conventions there. Notice because it's being passed as an extra, as a key for an extra, we start it with this word extra underscore. Like convention is, if it's a name of an extra, then it should start with extra underscore. Also, things to notice that I made this public. I made this public because I need to refer to this constant not just in this file, but in other files. So here in the adapter. Cool? By comparison, notice that log tag is private, right? Log tag is private and my extra is public. My extra is public because I need to access in other files. My log tag is private because I don't want to use it in other files. Does that make sense? Right? So some of these constants will be private and some of them will be public based on whether or not other files need to get access to them. Cool? Or should get access to it. Okay. So back to the adapter. So now rather than hard coding that, I'm going to say let's refer to the class where it is. So movie details activity dot extra movie ID. So there I'm using a constant instead of hard coding the string. Again, this really the main reason for this is a software engineering thing, in that those strings constantly change and they need to be in two different places, so I want to make sure that those stay in sync. Cool? And that way the connection between them is also pretty obvious. It's like, okay, I'm going over to movie details activity, so movie details activity should happen. So anywhere that's going to movie details activity needs to pass me movie number. Okay. So the next question is, how do I read that? Okay. So I've passed it over. I've created the intent with that extra. Over in the details activity, I need to read that value. So I might go down here, and I might start reading some data from there. So maybe get intent, and I might say, okay, let's start by getting the intent. Intent is equal to get intent. So if you call get intent in the activity, that will give you the intent that we use to start your activity. Okay? Get intent will give us the same intent that was used to start the activity. It's worth mentioning that we can only use this within lifecycle once the activity's been created. So for instance, I can't ask for get intent up here in a variable because that would be before we know what the intent is, right? So you can use this in onCreate, but you can't use it before onCreate. Cool? In terms of that intent, I want to read out the data that I'm interested in. So in this case, it's the movie ID. So string movie ID is equal to intent. And then there's a bunch of getters. And the getters are based on what type of extra I'm pulling in. So for instance, if the data is being passed over as a string, I'm going to call get string extra. If I was passing over a Boolean, I would call get Boolean extra, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're passing over a long or a double, long would be get long extra, get double extra, et cetera. I'm passing over a string. That's what I want. And I'm going to use that constant that we declared above. So you see that a constant appearing both on the source, where we go to the activity, as well as we have to put the same string on the other side. So again, that's the reason for the constant. Okay, now I'm going to use that movie ID and just render it as the title. Just for testing purposes, I'm going to toss that in so I can see that that is working. So if I click on a movie now, there we go. Still work in progress, but movie 2, no data, matrix 3, etc. Cool? Makes sense? So I can pass small pieces of data that way. It is worth mentioning that you do want to keep the data that you put inside of the intent small. It should be really, really small. Part of the reason for that is that all of the data that you put in these intents will more than likely at some point need to be saved to a file. So specifically, If Android runs out of resources and it needs to close your application, it's running in the background, it needs to close it, it will save that intent to the file, so that later when you come back to it, it can load that back up and start the activity. One of the cases where that happens actually is if you shut the phone down completely, it'll save those intents to the file. When the device turns back on, it will recreate all those activities using those intents. Does that make sense? Another thing to watch out for is, let's say I have an app and this gets bigger, so I'm maybe 5 screens in. All of the screens, all those screens in the back stack, those are still technically open, and part of the way that those get restored is using the intents. Does that make sense? So if you find yourself putting megabytes of data into the intent, you're doing something wrong. Yes?
In this example, we've only passed the ID.
Yes.
Would it be megabytes of data if you passed the title, description, genre?
If you put all of it together, potentially yes, right? If you passed all of the data that you needed to render the detail screen, potentially yes. Because you have other things like, well, what might I want to display on there? I might want to display the reviews. I might want to display some images, some video, maybe there's some audio files, etc. The list can get pretty long, right? So the habit is that all I want to pass through here is the ID in general. It is possible that you could add additional things in there. Like I could add the name and the description and other pieces like that, but I don't want to do that. The other reason I don't want to do that is, remember that I said that the activity can get invoked from other pathways, right? It might not just be coming from the list, right? And if it's coming from the list, that might seem easy to just add all those details, the description and the summary, description and the title and all of those things, and pass it through. It's not so easy when you're coming from somewhere else. Does that make sense? Does everybody follow me with that? So it's much easier in general to just pass the ID, and that's what you should do. That's what I want you to do. Cool? Keep the data minimal and limit what you actually put in there. The good news with that is, because of Firebase doing local caching, it actually won't be very expensive to go get all the data again, because it more than likely will just hit the cache. It will more than likely this document will already be in our cache, so when I ask for it from Firebase, Firebase is just going to serve it out from the cache. Cool? So I'm actually not saving that much if I don't pass the other pieces. I'm losing my logic. Okay. Next up. So the next thing we have to talk about is how to build out the view model. I think we're at 2 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take a quick 15-minute break, and we'll talk about how to do the view model. So let's come back at 2:10. So what we've gone over so far is I've added that second activity, right? And I've set up the listener, the quick listener, to send us over to that second activity. And then we looked at, okay, now I can send the ID of the movie over. Right, so far, hopefully pretty simple, right? Those are the basic building blocks of how we get data from one screen to another, okay? What I want to talk next about is how do we set up the view model? And remember, this is a newer feature in Android that we've added and we've been working with, right? One of the important things to understand is the expectation is that every activity has its own view model. So that view model kind of represents the data and the logic that goes into that particular screen, okay? So that means if you have 5 different activities, you probably should have 5 different view models, right? There should probably be a view model that's unique to that. So that means, that's part of why I called my first view model, I called it my movie list view model, so that here I can have my movie details view model. Names I would stay away from is just calling it movie view model or game view model, because then you don't have that distinction to know which screen it goes with. Make sense? So when you name these, it's generally going to be like, hey, I have the movie list activity and the movie list view model, the movie details activity and the movie details view model. Cool? Or movie details model. So here's how I'm going to kind of build up the view model for the movie details. So there's some example of this code that you'll see on screen. And I've set this up in a very similar way to the way we set the other one up, is kind of working through that same process. Okay? So remember, a view model has to extend a view model. So we see that up first, is that it extends view model. I'm adding the log tag in there, and I'm taking that same approach of let's just use the class.getSimpleName to build in that tag. I need another reference to the Firebase, the Firestore DB, because I'm going to need to access the database. I'm going to have a registration for the movie data, so I'm going to go ahead and save that so I can create that and unregister it as I need to. I'm also going to create a place to store the ID of the movie that we're looking at. So that's my general kind of like, here's some pieces of data I know I'm going to need as global variables, or not global variables, instance variables. Also, in terms of live data, what is the stuff that I'm exposing? Well, I'm exposing a movie, right? Which turns out, remember, the movie document is actually going to contain the entire movie details. So that actually has almost all the information I need to show this screen. But in addition to that, sometimes things go wrong, so I'm adding additional fields, right? So I've got one field, mutable live data, that's going to hold the movie object as a whole. One holding a string for here's the error message if something's wrong, if there's an issue. And the last one being for a snack bar, which is kind of, remember how I've set up some of the other ones. It's just I had some more live data as things went on, right? And that's oftentimes what's going to happen. As things go on, you're going to add more live data. But this is the basic starting point we're going to be. In terms of the constructor, again, I need to get an instance of that Firestore because we're going to be using the database. And I'm going to set up these live datas. Now, one thing I'm not doing in the constructor is I'm not going to fetch the movie. The reason for that is I don't know the ID of the movie yet. Okay? I don't know the ID of the movie yet. The reason I don't know the ID of the movie yet is actually your constructor can't take any arguments. From a view model, it has to have a default constructor, a no argument constructor. So I can't call that and I can't go make the fetch immediately because I can't know the ID of it yet. I have to wait until the activity tells me what the ID of the movie is. Okay? So rather than setting that in the constructor, I'm going to set that up later. Okay. Next up, looking at the onCleared method. Remember, we want to implement this in all our view models. And I'm just going to unregister any. If I have this listener, I'm going to cancel it, right, to make sure that I'm not getting more updates from the database. I've also got some getters, so you can get out the movie ID, you can get the movie object, the movie live data, you can get the movie error, and you can get the snack bar, right? Things we set up. General overview. I've got another message here to clear out the snack bar, because remember when we show it, I need to immediately get rid of it so it doesn't get shown multiple times. And then here's where we start to get to the interesting stuff. So I need, at some point, I need to have the user tell me what ID of the movie is, and I need to go fetch that from the server. Make sense? Caveat is, unlike the list, I can't fetch it immediately. I have to wait until this function's called, and then I can go fetch it. Does that make sense for everybody? The kind of general overview, right? So all of the interesting logic is really here in that function. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and add this class and bring in the example code, though, to start with. So I'm going to add under UI a new Java class, and this is the movie details view model. Add. And I'm just going to copy all that code verbatim over. Now I didn't include what my imports are, so I'm going to have to go Alt Enter and import all those things one by one. Beep. One thing to realize here is on this live data, I have a movie instead of a movie summary, because remember, I need all of the data in the movie object for this particular view, not just some of the data. Cool. So those are the imports that I ended up with after adding all that in there. Any questions so far? Does this make sense how I've thrown together that skeleton for the model? Part of it's just kind of you putting the pieces together one by one. Usually, just for mention, I usually start with the live data and then kind of work my way out from there. Okay. So, let's talk about what we need to do in this method. What do I need to do to fetch the movie in particular? All right, so there's a few steps to this. So first things first, this is, notice the name. I could have called this set movie, or set movie ID, be a name that I commonly see. It's like, hey, it's kind of like a setter. I'm setting the movie ID. But it's also doing a bunch of other things, right? And so I usually try to avoid calling something set if it's doing more than just setting a value and being done. So I'm calling this fetch movie because it's effectively what we're doing. Say, here's my ID, let's go fetch that movie. So first thing I do is I save that variable. So I'm going to say this.movieID is movie ID. So I'm going to save the new updated ID. I'm unregistering or removing any registration that we previously created. So if I was previously monitoring, looking for another movie, I want to disconnect that so I'm not getting notifications or updates about two different movies. Make sense? So if there's a previous movie there. Next thing I need to do is I need to check if you actually gave me a movie ID. And I'm going to say, hey, if the movie ID is null, well, there's no point in us proceeding to call the database. Let's just tell the user that there's a problem, right? So at that point, I'm just going to say, hey, no movie selected. Put that in the error text as well as putting that in the movie in the snack bar. So if that does happen, then we have an easy way to see that in the UI, right? That first case shouldn't happen because ideally I never get to movie details without an ID, but it can sometimes happen depending on how you go through things. And especially in Android Studio, there's this button. Remember, I've usually been hitting, let me pull that back up. I've been usually hitting this Run App button. You'll notice that there's another button here, Apply Changes and Restart Activity. I've had the issue that sometimes when I click that, it erases the intent. So you might find that, okay, I clicked that button and now my ID is null. Because it restarted the activity, but it restarted it with no data, no extras. So little things to watch out for. So that's why I'm being extra. One of the reasons I'm being extra cautious. All right. Next up, assuming we do have an ID, then I can go query the database. So I'm going to say, let's save the registration. We're going to go to the movies collection, right? That's where our movies are. And rather than asking for a query, rather than asking for multiple documents, I just want a single document, right? So I'm going to say document. You kind of remember we talked about this last week. If I want to get something by the ID, I can't use where equal to. You have to use document, okay? If you want to get a single document by its ID, okay? So to get that single document, add a snapshot listener. The snapshot listener here's a little bit different. It doesn't get a query snapshot in there. It gets a document snapshot in there. So that's why I'm asking for document and error there. Okay. If there's an error, I'm just going to display that to the user. So if something fails, you know, maybe there's a missing index or whatever it may be, I'll do this. If the document does exist, notice 2 checks in here. I'm checking that the document's not null and that it exists. You need to check for both of those things. Okay. Because it may be that you have an ID and it goes, it's like, okay, yes, that query worked perfectly, but I found out that there wasn't a document with that ID. In that case, exists is going to return false. Okay. So if it does exist, we'll show it. We're going to update the movie live data with it. And I'm going to say, okay, well, there's no error at this point, and the movie's been updated. Otherwise, we're going to say, hey, the movie doesn't exist. So there's 3 different failure scenarios here. Do you see that? You don't have an ID. The ID is null. There's some error in trying to get the data, right? Some sort of server error. Or there were no errors, but the document doesn't exist. Do you see that?
So it's not in the database, right?
It's not in the database, right? So there's 3 different error scenarios that I'm having to deal with, which is one of the reasons why I want to make sure I have a place in the UI to show the error. Does that make sense? The snack bar is helpful, but the snack bar is only there for a short time. And I don't want to leave the user with a blank screen and no error message. The benefit of having the error text in there is that it stays, right? It persists. Cool. Okay. So that's my logic behind it. Hopefully you see that there's nothing terribly new here, right? As far as the view model goes, really the only difference is I'm using this .document method to get a single document instead of doing a query and getting a list. Other than that, it's almost the same thing that we've been doing. Okay. So back to this. That's oh, I need to bring that code in. Let me bring that code in. Beep. Drop that in here. And it looks like I still need to extract that walk. Okay. Let's try to look at the next piece. Okay. So the next piece is where I'm going to start hooking these 2 pieces together. I need to hook the activity together with the view model that we just created. So in terms of variables, I need to have those 2 constants I've already created. I need to add some state variables. I'm probably going to want to keep the movie ID as well as a reference to the model. In terms of onCreate, we need to make sure we're getting movie ID. I've done that part already. And then we need to bind to the view model, right? So in terms of how I bind to the view model, I'm going to use that view model provider, create a new view model provider, tell it to call get, and I'm just saying, hey, get this other view model. So movie details view model instead of trying to get there. So notice that I'm not calling one of the things to notice here, we did this with the other activity, but notice I'm not calling new movie details view model, right? And that's why, because I'm not calling new, I'm not explicitly constructing it, I can't pass anything to the constructor. Does that make sense? Because I'm not the person calling because my code's not explicitly calling the constructor, I don't have a way to pass additional data through. That's why I need to pass it later. So I construct the model and then immediately call model.fetchMovie, and that's where we get the movie ID, right? When I call fetchMovie, that's where the movie ID gets in there. I can then set up all my observations. So for instance, I can say, let's observe the movie and the movie live data, and we'll update the movie there. We'll want to observe the movie error, update the movie error there, and also observe the snack bar and show the snack bar there. Okay? So I need to set up those parts in my main activity. So, or not main activity, movie details activity. You need to be on the right activity. So under movie details activity, you add some variables for state. So state, what were the two things we had? We had private string movie ID and private movie details view model. That's our model. So add those two variables. Go down here. I want to save that to the instance variable instead of saving it to the local variable. And now I need to bind the model. So bind model, we get the view model. So model is equal to new view model provider. Pass in activity dot get movie details view model dot class. There's my model. Tell it to fetch the movie. So I'm going to pass in the movie ID. That's going to kick that process off to query the database. Now I just need to observe all of the different pieces that I'm interested in. So get movie dot observe. This, make sure it gets unregistered. So this, and that's going to get a movie. And so I need to flesh that out in a second to show the movie with the title and description, etc. And model dot get movie error dot observe this movie error. I want to update the error text that I have. So movie error text dot set text. I'm going to set that to that error message. And I want to make sure I hide it if there's no error to show. So movie error text dot set visibility. Check if it's null. So movie error, if it's not null, then it's going to be visible. And otherwise it's going to be gone. So it's not going to take up any space if there is no error to be shown. With the snack bar, observe this message, and if the message is not null, if there is a message to be shown, then I need to show a stack bar. Make, let's hook that to the title. Movie title text. Because the error will not necessarily be visible. And I need to show that message. I need maybe a short duration to show that. And then I need to remember to clear it from the model. Okay. So that's a pretty good starting point, right? Things I might try to do here, just from a testing perspective, I might want to say, okay, well, we've got the movie now. I might want to say, let's set movie title text. And for the moment, I'm just going to set it to the movie ID. I'll come back to this here in a minute in terms of showing the movie. So, pop into here, movie updated, up into there. Good so far.
Okay.
Now, so what I'd probably like to do here is set this to the name of the movie. And I'd like to set the description to the movie dot description. I have a little gotcha though. Notice it doesn't, notice that the movie, the description is in red. Okay. So notice here, cannot resolve description. Well, my movies don't have descriptions yet, right? My movies don't have descriptions. So I could try to just put some placeholder in there, right? To just see if that's working, if we're getting at least the name. And I could pull in other data if I wanted to. Notice that I get a crash. Notice that here it's crashing.
Crash is on name because that one must not have a name, huh?
Let's take a look. So logcat, so you're saying it doesn't have a name. It's actually maybe something else. Info error. Try it again. And oh. Why is it filtering down to just? Why do I not have a? I might have had this running too long. Let me restart the emulator. AVD manager. I think my logcat might have gotten disconnected. And now it's stuck. Wake up. I do not know how long that's going to take to revive. There it goes finally. Alright, so NexusS. There we go. There's something. There we go. Okay, that's what I was trying to get to. So we can see what kind of exception it is, right? So according to this, it is a null pointer exception. Null pointer exception means that something was null. I tried to dereference it, right? Mm-hmm. I tried to call a method on it, try to access a field. I can't do that. And so if we look further at the error, it says, hey, I tried to access the movie's name, but the movie was null, right? I tried to access name on a null thing, right? So here in the observe, I was assuming, which I shouldn't assume, that the movie would be non-null. So remember, initially we get into the screen and we haven't loaded the movie yet. We haven't fetched it from the database yet. So initially the movie is null. In addition, we have some other cases. If you looked at my view model, you saw there were some other cases where I intentionally set it to null, such as if the movie doesn't exist, right? Then we're going to end up with null. So I do need to check for that. So I might need to say, hey, we're going to do one thing if the movie is null, and we're going to do another thing if it isn't. Okay, so in this case, where there is no movie, I need to set the title and the description. So maybe I say movie title text, and maybe we set that to null or empty string, either way. Movie description text, set text to null. So I need to make sure that if we don't have a movie yet, or there isn't a movie there, that those things are not showing outdated data. There we go. So crash, no more to that crash. First time it will go in here. The second time when the movie actually comes in, and we'll go to the second case. So first it comes into the if, and then it comes into the else. Good so far, right? So what about the description, right? You're going to find more than likely that once you get to the point with this, well, there's some additional data we want to show on this screen that we didn't show in the list. Make sense? Got a lot more space. We got a lot more space to deal with. So we have more space to show more things. Okay, so the description is typically something we don't show in the summary, but we do show maybe in the details. Okay, so I need to modify my model. Remember, so I'm going to go into the movie class, and I'm going to add a description. Public string description. Easy. Okay. So we have a description now. Notice I'm not adding this to the summary because I don't want to show this in the list. I don't want to show this where we're showing summaries. I'm just showing this when we're on the detail screen. Cool. So we have additional details we're adding to that document. And I can come back to the activity now and utilize that. So I can say, now that I have that property, let's do movie.description here. Let's try to run that. We still get this, right? Notice we don't get a null reference exception here because remember, you only get the null reference exception if you're trying to dereference it, right? So here, the description is null, the movie is not. So that's okay, that doesn't cause a problem. But we're seeing no description because I have no descriptions in the database. Okay. That may be simple enough to stop there and leave that. Obviously I need to go add some description to the database, but I also might sometimes want to inform the user that there's no description, right? Does that make sense? I might sometimes want to tell the user that there is no description for this movie so that they know that it's working, that there's missing data. So I might want to say, well, if this is kind of nested, movie.description is null. I might say else here. So that's the case where there is a description. I might say movie description text, set text, and maybe say no description.
Is the ternary valid to replace that?
Yeah, ternary's fine there as well.
Okay.
You could totally use a ternary if you want to. The only reason I'm not is because once I extract, it's kind of easier to look at.
Okay.
That's the only reason I didn't. So that's what's going to show here. But remember, I need to extract hard-coded strings like that. So Alt-Enter, no description. So I'm going to use just the ID. Cool. So that's been extracted. The only reason I didn't use a ternary is because the syntax is a little bit cleaner this way. Can be. But if you want to use a ternary, you totally can. Cool. So we have the starting of a detail screen. Okay. I'm going to go to the Firebase console. I'm going to add in some descriptions. Firebase console. Go to my project, add that in. Firebase store, and go to movies here. Now, do remember that this is live, right? I've hooked it up with the live data. I've hooked it up with the snapshot listener. So if I start to put some data, it's immediately going to show up on screen, which is awesome, right? If I determine that I need to change the name of the movie, it's immediately reflected on there this way. So maybe I just say second matrix movie for simplicity's sake. Oh, got an extra W there at the end. And so I can pretty quickly see what's going on there. This is kind of helpful from the perspective of the developer, that it's updating life like this, because it means I don't have to like constantly rebuild the project. If I want to change back-end data, I just like make it, and I can, my designer can kind of preview it and see it live without having to do a lot of extra work to test it, right? So it makes it really easy to test these changes. Cool. Okay. Any questions there? All can make sense, right? So the new, I mean, there's a few things that are different with the detail screen, but a lot of it is kind of the same principles, right? The new thing is using an intent to start another activity, right? And going through that process of needing to add another activity. Okay. So other things I can check. Let's say I go add a test document. Name is test. And if I go back, find that movie, there's test. I can even try to delete that document. And now we're in that case where movie doesn't exist, right? So you saw that from the mu model. Remember, I had it render that message. So awesome, right? All good. So you can see that case can happen, right? If movies are being, or things are being removed, then you might get into that case. All right. Last thing on the docket is we need to talk about up navigation and back navigation. Okay. So what we want here is, you'll see in the screen preview, this is my first screen, like you can think of this as main activity, and here's my detail screen, the child activity over on the right. The difference here is that there's an arrow. See the arrow in the app bar? That's what we call the up button, or the up navigation button. It sits there to the left of the app bar text. Okay. This is the official wording from Android. It says every screen in your app that is not the main entry point, which are all screens that aren't the home screen, must, wording from Google, must provide a navigation that directs the user to the logical parent screen in the app's hierarchy. So this is a requirement from Google. You're going to push this to the Play Store, you need to follow this requirement. Okay? This is a standard app requirement. So we need to add that button. Okay. So in order to add that button, the way that we do this is we make some changes to the manifest. Okay. So the way we add that button is we're going to go to the manifest. We're going to look for the appropriate activity. Okay. And then we need to add two things. We need to add this parent activity name attribute. Okay. Which says what's the parent activity. And we also need to, inside of it, add this metadata piece, okay? One thing that you might see from the documentation, you've got this approach. This first approach is really the short one, the parent name, parent activity name. And I wish that that was the only one we had to put in. I've had some issues with a few things in that this one for metadata that was originally introduced to Android as a backwards compatibility issue. And in theory, if you're not targeting older devices, which we aren't, you shouldn't need it. My experience, though, has been if I switch over to something called the support bar, which is helpful, support bar is replacing the app bar that's built in, gives you some more flexibility to do certain things with it. Then I do need this. So the support app bar still requires this, even on newer versions of Android. Okay, so I would ask that you put both of those things in. There's a little bit of a discrepancy here. Notice that in the metadata, here Android.value is pointing to main activity. I'm also pointing to main activity and parent activity name, but notice the values there are different. Everybody see that? Those two values are different. So here I'm saying just dot main activity, and here I'm specifying the full path to it. Unfortunately for this metadata, it does have to be the full path, has been my experience, because it doesn't work without it being the full path, with it being relative, versus this one can be either. The parent activity name can be either. When you see short paths like this is basically a relative path. It's saying relative to your package name. Well, it's just in that package .main activity. It's not in a subfolder. So for instance, if main activity was in the UI folder, it would be .ui main activity. Or if it was in data for some weird reason, it would be .data main activity. Cool? Make sense? So I'm going to make those two changes to the manifest so that we can get that icon. So back up to main activity. In here, I am going to say parent activity name and point that to movie details. Now, one thing you might have noticed, and hopefully you've seen this before because it's the same thing as with HTML, you'll notice that this tag ends in a greater than, and this one ends in a greater / greater than. If it ends in a / greater than, that's saying that it's an empty tag and it doesn't have an end. So in order for me to add stuff into it, I need to change that from / greater than to just greater than and have an end tag. Okay? Because initially when it puts in there, it doesn't add an end tag because, well, it's empty. So I need to add that in now. So metadata name, and I need to pull that Android .support .parent activity. And unfortunately, IntelliSense will not help you with that part. I wish it did, but it will not help you remember what that what that special string is. And for the value, I need to specify main activity again, but I need to actually specify it all the way out. Oh, I need to close the tag. So that's an empty tag. I can do the slash greater than. So with those two tiny tweaks to the activity tag, there we go. So now you're seeing the little arrow up there. That's all we have to do. I just make a change to manifest. Okay. And so that says that the parent activity of this is main activity, which means if I click on this button, it's going to go over to main activity. Cool. We said it's the parent, so that's where you go when you click that button. Now, it has a little bit of a weird behavior. The back button and the up button don't actually necessarily behave the same way. The first thing to realize is that back is always going to take you to the previous screen, but up is going to take you to whatever screen you specify here. So not necessarily going to take you to the same screen. One common gotcha is watch what happens if I hit back here. You'll notice I'm still in the same place where I was in the scroll, in the recycling, right? Same place. If I hit back, it's putting me back in the same place. Because what's happening is it's just destroying the details activity and coming back to main activity. Make sense? Here's a weird thing with Android, and I really wish this was not the case. If I hit up navigation, it navigates me all the way to the top of the screen. Because if I hit back, it doesn't recreate main activity, but if I hit up, it does recreate main activity. So it actually destroys main activity and creates a new instance of it. And because of that, we lose state like this. And in fact, I would also be losing any state that I have if I filtered down to, say, genres. If I filter down to comedy and go on here, right? If I hit back, it's still filtered to comedy. If I hit up, it's not filtered to comedy. Because again, we're losing state. Does everybody see that? I kind of understand why Google did it, in the sense that I kind of understand what they're trying to do with up navigation versus back navigation. I don't think that that's a desirable user behavior. Is everybody with me on that? For me, I largely don't think that those two things should do something different in most cases. Does that make sense? Kind of, you understand the reasoning? Generally speaking, I think those should do the same thing. And so there is work that you could do. You could try to maybe somehow try to preserve where it is in the scroll view and other sorts of selections. Unfortunately, most of those things don't work because the activity is being recreated. So you're really losing state. So just to talk about things from a little bit of a theoretical standpoint. So in terms of terminology, sometimes you'll see up navigation called ancestral navigation because you're navigating through the child and parent ancestry, right? So when you hit up, you're going through ancestral navigation. Back navigation is also known as temporal navigation because you're going back in time, back to screens where the user was previously. Okay, so that's the words that you'll often see as ancestral navigation and temporal navigation, referring to those. Up navigation we trigger by pressing up. Back navigation we trigger by pressing back. I prefer to have, and I think most users expect them to be the same, but as you can see, there's some bugs with the up navigation, right? It's not desirable oftentimes that you lose that state. I've had other issues with it as well. Like for instance, because it's going back, if I have any data in that intent starts it back out clean with no extras when I hit up navigation. which becomes a problem if you're digging down further, right? So maybe I have further down, I go to, hey, I want to add a review to that movie. Well, that's another screen. If I go up navigation, it's recreating that previous screen without the ID of the movie. So if I keep their behavior of up navigation, I lose the movie ID. Does that make sense? So because of that, I actually prefer to do what might be considered a hack, but it's a pretty popular answer on Stack Overflow, so I think I'm not the only one, and this is kind of where I found it. So what we can do to make them behave the same is we override on the child activity, we override on option item selected. That takes something called a menu item. I say if the menu item that was selected is home, then I call on back pressed, and otherwise I do this. Now, to give you some background to what this is, because we haven't talked about all of these pieces yet. In Android, there's a thing called a menu. Okay, menu specifically is a menu of like options. Okay, menus are typically used to add additional options to the app bar. Does that make sense? So, for instance, like that arrow, notice it's on the app bar. It's kind of one of the options on the app bar. The difference is it's one that's baked into Android instead of being one that I would add. So if I was adding some additional options, I would also override this for those additional options. So I'm saying if the option that they selected is home, which is the ID of the up navigation, then we're doing something different. So I'm saying let's call on back pressed. On back pressed is what gets called when you actually press the back button. And then I say return true. Return true says don't do your default behavior. Return true says instead of doing the thing you would normally do when you press up, do this instead. So that's it. I'm just telling it to do on back pressed instead of doing its normal navigation for up. Okay. And then otherwise, any other options that you pick, we just call the superclass. So I'm just changing the behavior for that one button. This is pretty easy as a fix because I can drop it in directly into the movie details activity like that. I'll enter to just fix the imports. And we're up and running. So things like if I filter down to comedy now and hit up, no problem. So up navigation and back navigation work the exact same way. This is tremendously helpful because it also means you don't have to test two different pathways. You don't have to see what does it do when I do press the up button, what happens when I press the back button, because they're the same. Does that make sense?
Wow.
What?
I'm just surprised.
Yeah. So it's a pretty quick fix to get those back to the same thing. It's just like, here's the answer. But it really, really changes the user experience and the number of bugs you have to deal with to do this. Cool. Make sense? So it looks kind of hacky, but it's actually very solid. So that is, I think, really the end of what we needed to talk about. So I've got it going down, I've got it going up, and the rest of it is really just go through your app and flesh out the details. You know, put additional data there, and flesh it into the console. Cool. So that is it for my lecture today.
That's two.